Hey everyone, good evening and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Debra Perlin. I am the Policy Director at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, affectionately known as CREW. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad that you could be here for this important conversation. Lessons from an Insurrection, Corporate Political Giving, and Combating Corruption in a Post-January 6th World. When we think about January 6th and the attack on the U.S. Capitol, I think many of us rightly think about the interruption of the counting of the Electoral College votes, the people who stormed the building, and those that incited them to storm the Capitol building. But part of that conversation is one about corporate giving. In the immediate aftermath in the days following the insurrection, many corporations pledged to suspend political giving to members of the Sedition Caucus and the 147 members of Congress who voted not to certify the 2020 U.S. presidential election. But in the ensuing weeks after those pledges were made, we saw corporation after corporation go back on their word and start giving money to these corporations once again. And in fact, within just a few months of the insurrection, corporate and industry PACs had given upwards of $2.6 million to the Sedition Caucus and to the party committees that supported them. To date, corporations have given upwards of $60 million to the Sedition Caucus, and 2/3 of the original companies that pledged to stop or suspend corporate giving have gone back on those commitments. So for today's conversation, I'm here with a number of speakers who I'm going to introduce to talk about what this has to do with corruption and what this also has to do with protecting our democracy. So I'm going to start at the end and move towards me in making introductions. So on the far end of the table, we have Justine Ellis, who is a senior policy advisor at CREW. Next to Justine, we have Richard Eidlin, who's the National Policy Director at Business for America. Next to him, we have Professor Ciara Torres-Spelliscy, who's a professor of law at Stetson University. We then have Robert Maguire, who's the research director at CREW. And next to me is Angela Lee, who is a researcher at CREW. So we're going to start with kind of just some framing questions so we can kind of understand what this conversation is and how these themes of corruption and democracy fit together. Ciara, I'd like to start with you. Can you start by telling us just a little bit about what January 6th has to do with the theme of corruption? Why are these two topics together in tonight's conversation?
Okay, thank you. So I work on the intersection between corporate law and election law in my scholarship. And I have an occupational hazard of having to write about corrupt politicians. So I wrote almost an entire book about Donald Trump called Political Brands. And I'm really mad that he is taking over the next book too. So the book that I'm working on right now has the working title, The Democracy Litmus Test. And in that, I'm going to argue that as voters and as consumers and as investors, we have to hold both corporations and politicians to a democracy litmus test. You basically have to ask the question, is this good for American democracy or not? And I know that under normal circumstances, that would be a really hard test to apply, because think of the thousands of bills that go through state legislatures, all of the bills that go through Congress. It would be very hard to gauge your support of democracy trying to go through all of that legislation. But I think January 6th actually makes it sort of much more crystal clear. Were you trying to overturn a democratic election or not? And I think the other test that I would add into that is after the 2020 election, the majority of the states made it harder to vote. And I think that also fails a democracy litmus test. So when I think of January 6th, I think you have to focus on President Donald Trump. And what always strikes me with him is he was both Trump the man and Trump the brand while he was president. He never fully gave up control of the Trump organization. And I think when some of his behavior seems very curious, like from an objective point of view, why is he doing these things? I think the answer again and again and again is he thinks it's going to be good for his business. And now we know, thanks to a court case that was just resolved in New York, that the Trump organization was cheating the state of New York of taxes for 15 years in a row. And so when you think about Trump's motivations to stay in power, I think one of his motivations to stay in power after the 2020 election was his business interests. And that created all sorts of ethical dilemmas during his presidency, including the emoluments clause problems. But I think it also explains why he was sort of so hell-bent to stay in power once he lost the 2020 election. And what I think is so tragic about that is that his mob ruined a 220-year record of peaceful transfers of power going back to John Adams giving power to Thomas Jefferson. And so, as people who care about democracy, we have to hope that everyone from the 900 plus people who have already been charged for their roles in January 6th, but no one at the top has been charged yet. And what I hope from an accountability standpoint is that no one is above the law, including former presidents. I'll end it there.
I think you did a great job, Char, just now of kind of connecting this. But Justine, I'm curious from your work, because you work with civil society partners, does that connection make sense to folks in civil society that that January 6th and a corruption conversation fit together? Is that something you've kind of seen come through in your work?
Thanks, Debra. Yes, absolutely honored to be here among all of you in this gathering. In response to the question, is there in public imagination a connection between January 6th and corruption? I think the short answer is, in a word, no. Not really. And of course, I'll elaborate on that. But I think, in public imagination, and especially in kind of broader civil society spaces, there isn't an immediate association between January 6th as an attempt to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power and corruption as essentially the abuse of entrusted power for public gain. So as Debra flagged earlier, when thinking of January 6th, the image that often comes to mind are those of violent insurrectionists who stormed the U.S. Capitol building. But clearly there's obviously a wider story to tell on the intersection of democracy, capitalism, and political spending that help create the conditions conducive to January 6th. So at a good governance organization like CREW, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about accountability, as in who creates these enabling environments, and essentially who sought to overturn the will of the people, as well as those who help plan, fund the attack and spread the misinformation that really continues to threaten U.S. democracy today. So we keep thinking about these questions. So this is where, as was signposted before, this is where business ended up in the fray as a result of corporate political spending, the contributions made by companies directly and to third-party groups at the state and federal level that supported election objecting officials. So companies became implicated in January 6th and its aftermath because of political giving really aimed at maintaining access and influence. So I think what we're talking about here is, corruption as an attempt to keep a seat at the table rather than as something purely transactional or like a bribe or a gift. And this is something that various speakers at this gathering have really termed essentially soft corruption or more insidious corruption. So I think what we're going to talk about, and what I wanted to add here to Debra's question, is that on a related note, that companies are facing increased scrutiny around political spending that often doesn't line up with public commitments on creating a more sustainable world. And this is where civil society and civil discourse comes into play in terms of linking the accountability conversation around threats to democracy to really related challenges within a campaign finance system that facilitates unlimited and often covert political spending. So that's part of what's motivating our convening tonight. And I think to tackle this democracy issue, we need multi-sectoral engagement. But part of this process is generating public conversation and understanding the connection between an event like January 6th and corruption is really integral to the systemic reform that we really hope to achieve. So we're getting there one step at a time.
Well, you were talking about the role that civil society has to play in making these connections, and not to toot Crew's horn, but I think my colleagues right next to me are really doing a lot of work in making those connections. And so, Robert and Angela, I want to turn it over to you. Following the attacks of January 6th, your team developed what I think we've called the sedition tracker. So can you talk a little bit about what the sedition tracker is, and first of all, where did you come up with the idea, and what you've found?
Sure. So I've been working in campaign finance, tracking dark money campaign contributions for about 10 years, and I've seen repeatedly companies make these promises about values that they are going to, stop giving to politicians who support X, Y, Z, whether it is anti-LGBT laws or different racist or bigoted politicians, things like that. And what happens time and time again is that as soon as the attention that they get from those promises dies away, as soon as the eye of the media goes away, they immediately go back to doing what they were doing before, because they assume that no one is paying attention. And so when we saw those promises start rolling in after January 6th, we knew immediately if somebody doesn't track this, then they're going to start doing it again. And so we set about pulling all of the members of Congress who voted not to certify the election, and pulled all of their the Federal Election Commission data, put it all together so that we could see in real time. And this is really Angela's work, so I will turn it over to her, because she's the one day after day who is slogging through Federal Election Commission data, which is not the funnest thing to do, and it is incredibly complicated. But we knew that if we didn't do this, that the companies would essentially just go back to what they were doing. We saw it, for example, in the Affordable Care Act debates. This is the healthcare bill that was passed under President Obama, where there were companies that were making these grand public statements about supporting reform and working with the administration on reform, until it came out that they were actually funding the dark money groups that were attacking any member of Congress that supported reform. We saw this in state level examples where there were people running for attorneys general who were sort of behind the scenes going to payday lender industry groups and saying, I'll be your guy in the attorney general's office, and instructing them about how to use dark money to actually support their campaign and spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing it. So the aim here is to exert some sort of accountability on these companies. But the other really important point that I want to make about this is that it's not just about naming and shaming. That's an important part of it, but it's also the best possible example we could ever give of the corruption of the campaign finance system in America. And this, I don't mean sort of the old-timey corruption of bags of cash in return for specific bills. That still happens in some ways from time to time. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that a member of Congress was caught with a bag of cash in his freezer from defense contractors. So certainly that does happen. But what I mean is the corruption of the system, where essentially every day in Washington and around the country, members of Congress and powerful people are attending fundraisers. They are breakfast, lunch, and dinner going to meet with wealthy people who, solely by virtue of having enough money to give a campaign contribution big enough, they get face time with these powerful people who are deciding on bills, who are working on policies, who are promoting different projects and plans, and they are the ones who are getting the access and influence to these people. And it's not because they have a particular expertise. It's not because they are particularly impacted. Well, they are impacted in one way, but they are not the sort of the regular people who are impacted by these bills. It's solely because they have the money to give these contributions. Members of Congress go on weekend retreats where they just go to luxury resorts and they spend days at a time with people who are there solely by virtue of the fact that they have this money. And what that does is it skews the system in favor of people who generally have that much money to give. So it's not to say these people are going and saying, I'm going to give this campaign contribution so you do this. But I am giving this campaign contribution so that I can talk to you about doing this in a way that regular Americans don't have the opportunity to do. That's what I mean by corruption of the system. It's a corruption that leads to a certain socioeconomic level of people's interests being reflected in the bills and policies that are passed by Congress. And so that's the point that we wanted to make here, is that if an attack on Congress, an attack on the Capitol, aimed at, for the first time in our history, stopping the peaceful transfer of power, is not enough to stop this system where you are giving money to people who fed the lies that led to that, and who continue to foment those lies. That is the best indication we can possibly give of how broken this system is.
So, Angela, I'd love to turn it over to you. Tell us, what did you find in this tracker, and what are the lessons that we should be taking from it?
Yeah, sure. So as Robert said, it really is a slog to go through all the campaign finance data. And my job is to kind of look at the new records that come in each month to see which corporations are donating to which members of the Sedition Caucus, and also to monitor the new statements that companies are making as they try to defend their about face and actions. So what we have in the tracker is hundreds of companies that have made commitments after January 6th to stop giving to this group of people. They said some very strong words about their commitment to democracy and to a peaceful transfer of power, but without fail, almost every single one of them, or the vast majority of them, started quietly giving again months, sometimes weeks after the insurrection took place. And this ranges from big household tech companies like Facebook and Google to retail like Home Depot and carriers like UPS. Like from every sector of business, companies made these commitments and then broke their promises. And from looking at the campaign finance data, we can see almost in real time, there's a month's delay for the filing process, but as soon as a company breaks its word and starts giving to a member of the Sedition Caucus, crew knows, and we put out this this update on our social media, on our website, to inform the public as well. And right now, I think of the original 250 companies that originally made statements promising to stop giving political contributions to the Sedition Caucus, I think only around 60 still remain on that list that have kept their promises. So we commend those companies, but we also have done our fair share of kind of lambasting those companies that have taken themselves off the list. And it's an ongoing process. We will keep updating the public on when and if companies like Microsoft, which has kept its word up until now, we will know when and if they break their promise, and so will the rest of you.
That's a failing grade, only 60 companies having kept their promises. It's been a while since I've been in school. Definitely a failing grade. Richard, I want to turn it over to you. I mean, you work at Business for America, and your job is to work with corporations and to make the case for democracy with corporations. I'd love to get your sense of kind of why, when you work with these companies, what is the pitch that you give about why they should care about democracy and the health of the system?
Sure. Thanks, Deborah. Well, I just spent the past 2 days on Capitol Hill with a bunch of companies, Cummins, Salesforce, Marriott, PepsiCo, Hannon Armstrong, and some others. And we were talking about the Electoral Count Reform Act and why that's so important to get passed to clarify the rules by which the president and the vice president are elected, right? And make sure there's only one slate of electors. And the case we were making to Senate offices, mostly Republican offices, is that a stable political system engenders economic prosperity. And that instability is, while something that businesses deal with all the time, is not in their best interest and makes it difficult to retain employees, to make investment decisions, and that increasingly employees and other stakeholders are curious about the stability and the long-term success of the U.S. And foreign investors may decide this is not a great place to do business in the long term. So that's the simple, broad case for why a healthy democracy is important to business. But I want to step back for a moment and just, give another perspective on companies that chose to stop their spending or cease their spending entirely and drop out of the process of giving any more money. So, number one, I think it's really interesting to know that this was not an organized effort. This was an organic initiative on the part of those companies, dozens of companies, who chose to stop what they had been doing and not give money. So there was no campaign that was organized, and companies saw what each other were doing and decided that this is a fundamental threat to our political system. This is not in our employees or shareholders or stakeholders' interest, so we're going to withdraw. We're not going to participate in this process. The fact that so many companies have reneged on their commitment, is a real clear indication that companies are participating in a political process wherein they perceive they have to give money in order to have a seat at the table, right? Not all companies follow that rule anymore. Charles Schwab, as you may know, I think a year ago decided we're no longer going to participate in this process and we're not giving any money into the political system. We're just not going to do that anymore. Companies like Marriott have decided that they too are going to keep their commitment despite what risk they may run by being ghosted from a particular committee or not having access to a certain set of politicians. So, it's very much a two-way street here, right? The politicians expect, in some sense, that you have to contribute money to gain access to this process. But companies are beginning to wonder whether their investment is worth it. I'd also, suggest that this, in the work we're doing at Business for America, this political spending takes place within a broader framework, and a framework that colleagues at the Erb Institute at the University of Michigan refer to as corporate political responsibility, CPR, corporate political responsibility. So one of the huge problems we have when companies decide to give money is there's a lack, as Deborah noted, there's a lack of alignment within the company. So government affairs, who may manage the government affairs department, that may manage decisions about political spending, hasn't necessarily checked that out with corporation counsel. The board of directors may not really be aware of what decisions are being made. The people who work in the DEI units or within HR departments, they're not really certain either what's going on. So last point, and we can come back to this, is the promising and encouraging trend, I think, within the business community is a recognition that lack of alignment within the organization is causing a lot of these problems. Because the folks in government affairs and public policy, and God bless them, that's the folks I hang out with, those people are pursuing the company's self-interest, but at the same time, as the meetings with our colleagues demonstrated, they're also pursuing a values agenda that doesn't have commercial self-interest. So it's a tough world for those companies to navigate, I think. And the hopeful sign is that more companies are thinking about what impact does our political spend have on the health of our democracy, on the stability of our economy. And, it's no longer as easily as accepted as it was even 2 years ago that we have to give in order to get something. So so I'll leave it there, and maybe we can cycle back to that.
Yeah, I want to return to something Ciara actually said at the beginning, because I think it picks up with what Richard was just saying. You mentioned this idea of a corporate litmus test, and I'm assuming you meant a corporate litmus test in terms of democracy and making sure I'm understanding what you were saying properly. I'd love to, maybe we'll start with Ciara, but I would like to get kind of the entire panel involved in this conversation. If we're thinking about a corporate litmus test in terms of corporations and democracy and corruption, what does that look like? And what do we need to do to get there?
Well, one of the challenges with this, if you were going to key it to corporate political spending, is the dark money problem. So, just in case this concept has not hit your world, really quickly, what I mean by dark money is money that's spent in politics that's not traceable to the original donor. The way that corporate money becomes dark is you have a corporate spender that doesn't want to spend under its doing business as name. So it gives to a opaque nonprofit, and then that opaque nonprofit spends in the political system. And because of the interaction between our tax law and our campaign finance system, usually that means that the public is completely unaware where the original source of that money came from. So one of the confounding problems is this dark money problem. So between roughly 2008 and 2018, there was at least $1 billion of dark money in the federal system. Then in the 2020 election, there was $1 billion of dark money in that election alone. I think we're still waiting for the final tallies for the midterm. But all of that means that the public just has no idea where that $2 billion in dark money came from. And then there's additional dark money at the state and local level as well. So one big challenge with trying to hold a corporation to account for its political spending is you may not be able to find it. Different corporations have, I think, different risk tolerance for spending on the record. Chevron is very sort of notorious for actually spending under its own name, which is good if you're trying to track Chevron spending, but not all corporations take that approach. And one of the things that I think consumers need to start thinking about is, are the corporations that I give my consumer dollars to, are they supporting people who don't want me to exist? And I think that's the most clear when you're talking about, say, trans kids or the gay community. There is so much spending from corporations to the Republican side, and then those some of those Republican lawmakers spend all of their days writing legislation at the state level, which makes being gay or being transgender a living nightmare. And so I think it's fair to ask, like, are you spending, or in your role as a consumer, are you sort of contributing to your own oppression? And I think you can also ask that question when it comes to voting rights legislation. More than half of our states, between either in the 2021 or the 2022 legislative session, they made it harder to vote. And so I think you can think about the corporations that supported those lawmakers and whether you want to spend your precious dollars with those corporations when they are facilitating a less robust democracy.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I just to sort of springboard off of what Char was saying, there obviously are consumer decisions here, but also there are shareholders to the companies, there are employees of the companies. You know, you think about a lot of these tech companies, for example, they are trying to recruit the smartest and best employees that come from a lot of different diverse backgrounds, and they don't want their company doing a lot of these things and supporting a lot of these politicians. There are unions that have contracts with these companies. So there's a lot of different audiences that have different roles because, you know, some of the companies we're talking about are Lockheed Martin. Like, you can't not buy an F-35. You can't, there's, you know, there are so many companies that we don't have a direct relationship with in any way as consumers, but a lot of people do actually interact with those companies in different ways. And what I'm seeing, you know, as somebody who's been doing this for, you know, 10 years now, which is long, but not super long, is it seems like something has switched over the last few years, and that people are much more engaged on this subject than they have been. We've seen walkouts at Disney. We've seen walkouts at Netflix. We've seen students engaged on a lot of these issues where they're both walking out, but they're also rallying, and they're creating groups, and they are banding together and demanding accountability. We've seen shareholders who are pushing the companies that they own shares in to actually take action. And so there are a lot of different angles to sort of hold these companies accountable. And also, you know, to Char's point about dark money, you know, once we do get some accountability in the disclosed side of political contributions, we are going to face the problem of dark money, which is incredibly easy to use in the United States. I mean, we just filed a complaint today because somebody said the quiet part out loud. I'm sure that y'all have all seen Sam Bankman-Fried all over the place these last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But he just did an interview last week, said that he gave tens of millions of dollars to Republicans through dark money, intentionally to hide the fact that he was giving that money to them. Most people get away with this because they don't say that in live interviews. But the fact of the matter is that it is quite easy, and we have won 2 cases in this sphere, and we found exactly what we thought we would find. So in one instance, we fought for 7 years, had 3 cases where we actually forced a dark money group to disclose. And lo and behold, the dark money group was full of, yes, wealthy donors, but also corporations that were giving money to the dark money group to influence elections anonymously. And there are bills, there are things that Congress could do. They've tried to pass a Disclose Act multiple times over the last 10 years. One was this year, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And they fail because the only place that this is divided, or this is a polarizing issue in America, is right here in Washington. If you poll after poll shows that Republicans, Democrats both want more transparency, they want more regulation of political money. It is only here in Washington where you have one side trying to actually force more disclosure, create more regulations for campaign finance, and the other side saying this would limit free speech, this would chill free speech. That does not exist anywhere outside of these city limits.
And also, just a plug that the Disclose Act did fail, but there are also things that can be done through executive action that administration after administration has failed to do to make this easier. It's not in their personal interest. But, you know, I want to, this idea of corporate litmus tests, Richard and Justine, I want to bring you into this conversation. At the corporate level, at the grassroots level, do you see this idea of a corporate litmus test taking hold and kind of what that would look like?
Yeah, so there are a number of organizations. I mentioned the Herb Institute at the University of Michigan, which has developed a set of principles that companies are going to hopefully adopt as far as their corporate political responsibility, including how they spend their money. Then there's another organization called the Center for Political Accountability here in DC that is looking at the practices. So how do you operationalize the principles? If you want to be a responsible, accountable actor in our political economy, you have to have a set of principles, including transparency and disclosure. And then you have to figure out how do you operationalize that in practice, meaning you have the board of directors sign off on a political contribution. You run it through corporation counsel. You disclose. Robert mentioned about a lot of dark money, which is a huge problem. So can we get companies to disclose on a voluntary basis, right? Because if we don't get legislation, then there needs to be internal pressure within the business community, feeling that there's a sense of moral responsibility and obligation, which goes back to how companies perceive themselves as good stewards of society, as contributors, as being socially responsible. So I think, Deborah, there is a movement now. It's nascent, but it's encouraging. And there's a real evolution of thinking since the January 6th insurrection about, are we spending, says the company, are we spending our political capital, our advertising dollars, our engagement with stakeholders, the way we work with communities within which we operate, are we being responsible? And if not, then what practices do we need to adopt? And then maybe the third piece of that movement or this evolution is work that Business for America does, which is rather than critiquing the bad actors, which is not our approach, we want to hold up the Marriotts and the Charles Schwabs and say thank you and encourage them and laud their commitment to have a more stable political system. I'll give you a short anecdote from one of the meetings we had on the Hill yesterday. We were meeting with the Senate office, and my colleague from Marriott, as he was introducing himself, was a relatively big group. I think we had 10 companies and 2 staffers, including the chief of staff of one of the Senate offices. My colleague from Marriott noted that he was still very proud of the fact that they hadn't given any money to the Sedition Caucus. And he knew that was controversial, but they were proud of their decision. That caused a discernible shift in the look on the chief of staff's face from a Republican office. And he immediately said, well, did you do the same thing in 2016 or 2012 or going back to 2000 when there were objections to the Electoral College count? And the fellow from Marriott said, no, but we're going to reassess that. But that set into motion a somewhat contentious but productive conversation about woke corporations and hypocrisy and ideological inconsistency, according to the chief of staff of a Republican office. So, long story short, I think that companies are, some companies, not all, and there are plenty of examples of businesses not reassessing their role in society, but there is a movement now to do that, and I think that's encouraging.
Justine, you're kind of our ears and eyes on the ground at Crew and kind of how the grassroots is feeling about things like this. Can you give a little bit of color to that? How are folks feeling about corporate giving and about commitments to democracy?
Absolutely. So I think, as I understand it, kind of on this panel as, the humanist and trying to bring in some social science theory into this conversation. I guess I'd want to, listening to others on this panel, what I'd want to do is persuade you of one thing, which is that we really need to attend to the kind of the behavioral and relational dynamics, in addition to the very necessary kind of legal and regulatory ones at play in the context of corporate political accountability conversations and pro-democracy movements and in the service of sustained systems change. So I can share a very brief anecdote on this front from some of the work that we do in coalition spaces. And I think part of this is when we were first engaging in corporate accountability work in pro-democracy coalition spaces focused on January 6th accountability specifically, we came across an issue right away, which was that we formed this small creative working group, and some people were primarily from good governance organizations, others were from more activist grassroots type spaces, and others were also from business-oriented groups. And so the goal was to think about what does January 6th accountability look like in relation to corporate accountability. And what we noticed right away was that in some of our initial gatherings on this question is that it became abundantly clear that certain people who worked with the business community simply could not be in the same room as activists for fear of losing trust and credibility with their private sector clients. And this was something that was immediately apparent and perhaps totally understandable. When credibility and trust are your currency, you simply cannot jeopardize that. So these people needed to basically extricate themselves from the conversation, even to the point of declining calendar invites and unsubscribing from mailing lists so as not to leave a paper trail. So there was this immediate response. And what I also wanted to add in this point as well is that, the reverse is also true, that you can end up in situations where activists fear becoming mouthpieces for corporations if they get too cozy, and end up in situations where they might feel complicit in perpetuating unjust systems and exacerbating existing problems. So these types of interactions can lead to basically feelings of queasiness on many different sides and a number of different fronts. So I think these considerations might be self-evident to some people who are operating in this space, but it's also, at the same time, I think it illustrates one of the big obstacles to having these conversations, which is just the challenge associated with having meaningful multi-stakeholder conversation on democracy protection. And I simply offered this as an example of what's potentially happening at scale as well, the problem of having that inability to just simply be in the same room. And happy to say more about that.
Debra, if I could just build on Justine's
Sure.
for a moment. So we, Business for America and Crew, did a briefing on the first report. Maybe we did that in, May, okay? And we definitely heard from some of our members about, we're not going to be exposed here, are we? And
Can you just clarify what report you're talking about?
yeah, so this is a report that Angela was talking about, which identified companies that had stopped giving and then who kept their commitments, right? And that was the first report. And then I understand there's a second report coming out tomorrow or soon, not tomorrow, but January. Okay. So
It's been a busy week. Don't give us something else to do
I know
tomorrow.
tomorrow's Friday. Right? So the point, though, is in these dialogues, trust is really important. And, there are some in the business community who really appreciate what Crew does, and there are others who don't. And, not surprisingly, those who don't want to be transparent don't really appreciate the light being shined on them. But in this effort to build some bridges and build trust, we're going to do another event with Crew sometime after the second report is issued. And while it's Crew's job, I think, to critique those who didn't keep their promise, what we want to do in this next event is to hold up examples of companies that did and have them explain the process by which they've gone through to make a decision that they've stuck with. And that goes back to this idea of alignment within the company, right? So maybe those companies can model a different kind of behavior, and Crew has the data to distinguish, who's keeping or not keeping their commitment. And we want to pass that on to the business community so maybe they can, reassess the way they operate.
I mean, I think before you were talking a little bit about how peer pressure can be good for these sorts of organic campaigns. So maybe some peer pressure about holding up good companies can also be helpful. Robert, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to step back for a quick second because when Justine was asked, sort of what do the grassroots feel about corporate giving, I just wanted to sort of address kind of maybe a little bit of the absurdity of the premise of this conversation in the sense that, like, why are corporations giving money at all? Like, why do we allow corporations to give political contributions to begin with? You know, the reason we're doing this project is because we recognize that in our system as it exists, the corporations have an outsized influence, and they don't have morals in the same way that a human does as a living person. You know, they are a corporate person. We have corporate personhood in this country. But the fact that the Supreme Court has granted them First Amendment rights of a human being is kind of insane. And you know, a person has conflicting beliefs even within themselves. They have sort of needs and wants, but also they have beliefs and desires, and sometimes those can sort of come together and conflict and mix in different ways, that all of which inform your political beliefs and your political giving. A corporation, and also people die. Corporation is essentially an undying entity that exists solely for the purpose of increasing shareholder value. That is it. And the fact that we give them First Amendment rights to give political contribution, to engage in political speech, is kind of insane. And so I just wanted to recognize that fact, that like, ideally, what we should be talking about is, let's just not have corporations give political contributions anymore. But we are having this conversation in the system that we currently have, and trying to at least bend it towards better outcomes than we would get if we weren't trying to push them and hold them accountable.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because like our system is actually crazy. And we're at a conference, an international conference, and our system is crazier than most other government systems around the world. And I'm curious, I mean, there are constitutional loopholes to fixing the system that we currently have. But there are things we can do. And I'm curious, first, what things that we can do. And also, I recognize that we're having this conversation in the aftermath of the 2022 elections, really in the very aftermath, since the Georgia runoffs just finished. And I can't help but notice that this is not a very keen observation. This is a pretty obvious one. There were some crazy people that ran in this last election cycle. For those who don't follow American politics, you can take my word for it. There were crazy people that ran this last election cycle. And this rise of extreme candidates and the continued giving to them, both by individuals and by corporations, is something that I find exceptionally troubling. It's not just the Sedition Caucus at this point. It's these extreme candidates and the fact that they're still getting corporate money. So thinking about this rise of extremism and the continued corporate giving, we have to do something to the system. And I'm just curious, what are the ideas that are out there outside of the Disclose Act, which is a great one, but hasn't been passed? What are ways that we can think about how we can fix the system?
I mean, just briefly, you know, there are legal remedies, right? There are legislation. There's consumer pressure, clearly. And then I think, you know, within the business community, there are these nascent efforts that are underway where, you know, the good actors are beginning to be public about what they're saying. That's not going to maybe create a stampede, but there has to be, you know, from my perspective, some reassessment within the business community. Just as it took many years for companies to recognize they had an environmental sustainable obligation, that took 20 years. This is hopefully going to take a shorter period of time, but it is happening. And, you know, in the evolutionary process, this change needs to happen. And, you know, I think more companies are beginning to recognize that their own interaction in the political system that they rely on in order to benefit from, if they continue to invest in insurrectionists and crazy people, that may serve their short-term, serve their short-term commercial interests, but that's not in their long-term interest. And more companies are beginning to see that.
Ciara, do you have?
I mean, the good news from the midterm is that in all of the swing states, everyone who was running for Secretary of State or governor who was an election denier, they all lost. So I think, which is a huge relief. And the reason why that matters, in case it's not obvious, they would run the 2024 presidential election in those swing states. So it really mattered that these secretaries of state lost in particular. But it doesn't mean that no election deniers were reelected. So the Sedition Caucus is basically all back. And election deniers won in red states. Sometimes they won because they were running in uncontested elections, which is its own problem. But it is, I think, very troubling to see these election deniers get through Republican primaries. There were good people who lost their seats, who did bold things like the impeachment of Trump in the House. That was basically an electoral disaster for those people who were so bold and so brave. And at some point, we've got to turn that ship around. Just from a democratic accountability standpoint, we have to reward people who are brave in that way. Like, think of Adam Kinzinger. He was basically districted out of his district by the Democrats in Illinois. Or think of Liz Cheney. She was primaried in Wyoming. So she basically lost to Republicans. He lost to Democrats. I think the country needed both of them to be reelected, and we don't have either of them. So we're going to have to work on that. And I think part of trying to realign incentives is, having consumer pressure on corporations to be pro-democratic in the small d sense. Having shareholders, for example. One of the reasons why there's more transparency today from the S&P 500 is that shareholders at their own companies have put in shareholder resolutions asking for transparency on two fronts. One is corporate political spending in elections, and the other is on corporate lobbying. And because of that pressure, that internal pressure from shareholders, about half of the S&P 500 is more transparent today than they were the day that Citizens United was decided in 2010.
Richard and Angela, do you have anything you want to add to this kind of how we fix the system conversation? I mean, you guys literally are digging through FEC data. So you understand kind of how this data comes up and maybe where some of the fixes can be?
How to fix the system is
It's a small question.
Yeah, it's definitely an ask. I was thinking while the other folks were speaking that most of the crazy people in this election did lose, and that's because people turned out to vote them out. And democracy won on the ballot this past November, and that is my strongest hope is that democracy keeps winning on future ballots. So I think educating the public on, voting for issues other than inflation or things that impact people directly, but also thinking about some broader, perhaps more abstract principles like the rule of law and democracy and a peaceful transfer of power. Those things matter a lot too. And I recognize that there are some more immediate political concerns like inflation, the cost of living. But it's also important to realize that, I don't know, I feel like the economy is only going to get worse if we move towards a more authoritative or authoritarian state in this country.
I agree. I mean, I think you would also agree that the FEC could do a little better job in terms of cleaning its data and that kind of stuff. Yeah. I joke, but I do think that there are, a lot of the times we are reaching for big fixes. We want a Disclose Act. We want HR 1. All those things are important. We want the executive order on contractor giving. But also, one of the things that has always amazed me is that a lot of the information that is already there is provided in a way that is almost intentionally cumbersome or complicated in a way that makes it inaccessible to the public. Somebody said, I don't remember who this was, but that the lesson from Watergate is not that you try to hide your illegal activity. It's that you actually just provide so much information to the public that you actually effectively hide it from them because it's so hard to go through. And I think that's what we have in a lot of instances. I think the way that we provide personal financial disclosures from our members of Congress, the way that we provide a lot of campaign finance data, the way that the IRS provides data on any number of types of groups that can engage in political activity, is, the IRS still provides. First of all, you have to request the information by filling out a paper form and faxing it to them, and then they send you DVDs that come in the mail for something that should be a searchable database online.
So do you have a DVD player that you can? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, we had to specifically buy a DVD player, because who has those anymore, to actually process that information. That was up until at least 2018. I think they provide it on thumb drives now. That's still not better. So there is a lot of stuff that actually could be done to make it at least easier for watchdog groups and the public to track this information. But then you have those bigger issues. One thing, on what I was talking about in terms of corporations and their First Amendment rights, there is a weird sort of thing happening right now where the left has been saying for quite some time, that we need, it's absurd to give corporations, well, I shouldn't say the left, I should say in Washington again, because this isn't polarized outside of DC. But in DC, the debates go that, the left says it's absurd to give corporations First Amendment rights, but Republicans, particularly Mitch McConnell, say, no, this is, any sort of attempt to change this is chilling free speech. But now you do see Republicans pointing to woke capitalism, sort of saying that they shouldn't be able to engage in this kind of free speech. So there is sort of a weird confluence right now of anti-corporate free speech on both sides in DC. So I don't know. I mean, maybe we will be surprised and something will actually come of that as well.
Well, I'm going to take away from this conversation that Robert has a DVD player and might be the only person left in the. Oh, and you and the judiciary, fax machines also. One of the things that I find interesting about this conversation, that it's clearly politically toxic, as Richard was saying, he was in a meeting this afternoon with a Republican member, for corporations to tie their giving sometimes to democracy issues. But corporations have been much more willing to publicly, I think across the board, take stands on other issues. So, I mean, I'm thinking about in the aftermath of the immigration ban, corporations came out pretty strongly in support of immigrants' rights, and which is a good thing. I'm not trying to decry it at all. But I'm curious, when I think about, you see lots of corporate pledges and statements supporting if it's like diversity or immigrants' rights, or I'm thinking about Trump just had his infamous dinner with white supremacists and anti-Semites, and corporations did back away from some of those people. So what is it that makes the democracy part harder? And is it fair to call it hypocritical that it's easier for them to maybe take steps towards changing their spending on one side of the equation, but not the other?
Why it's hard. I think because we've all taken it for granted. Business community, just like the rest of America, has assumed we live in a fairly stable, sane environment where the rule of law is respected. Certain people get away with things, but that's not normally the way we operate, and that's been an assumption by the business community. So let's go back just 3 years in the middle of the pandemic. Many companies found themselves asked by dozens or hundreds of employees explain to me how I'm supposed to vote now? This thing, vote by mail, I'm not really familiar with that. Do I have to re-register? How do I participate? And companies found themselves under a lot of pressure to develop a capacity to now educate their employees. It's not something they had counted on. And it's just, that's a fact. Many, many companies, to their credit, stood up active educational programs in the companies. And then those same companies found themselves being asked to donate PPE. And I was told by a number of large companies, I thought this was the government's responsibility. And we're fine, we'll donate the water and the face masks and the plastic shields, but isn't this FEMA's responsibility, the Federal Emergency Management Administration? And the answer was no. Yes, and we have a dysfunctional political process under that current administration. So I think, Deborah, it's a great question, and the beauty of what's happened over the past 2 years is if you were interested in how our political system works, you could get a master's degree in government. Now people know there are 3 branches of government in America, right? Most people still don't know that and can't explain to you what those 3 branches of government are. But if you wanted to learn, you now are much more aware. And companies, again, took it all for granted. Maybe not those who were working in Turkey, or those who began to experience what's happening in Hong Kong, or those that have experienced appropriation and manipulation of capital markets in Hungary. But as Angela said before about authoritarianism, it is a new threat, it is a new risk that it's just been in the past 2-3 years. I really don't feel I'm exaggerating, that American businesses have said, this is really not nearly as stable as we thought it was, and we're going to have to change the way we operate.
I'd also add that some of what you were referring to, so around George Floyd, there was an enormous lip service, I will say, to diversity. Some companies went farther than others. They got into systemic racism and the problems in our policing communities of color. Lots of corporations pledged money that they were going to give, but it was always very ambiguous, like how you were going to give money, and no one could really keep track of who was giving. And so one of the things I'm finding in writing this book is I'm trying to do some tracking of like the George Floyd money, or sometimes it's referred to as the Black Lives Matter money. And a few things strike me. One, way more was promised than was ever delivered. And then the other thing that I saw is a lot of the giving was in the form of loans, which means the money will come back to the corporation with interest. And so I don't think when the average viewer looked at a pledge that we the corporation are going to help the Black community, I'm not sure that they thought of a interest-bearing loan as the vehicle.
Yeah, that's special.
I would also add that it's one thing to pledge money, even in the form of loans, to help these marginalized communities, and it's another thing to say we're going to stop giving money to politicians who don't hold these values. So I think, Deborah, your question originally was, why is it harder for corporations to back away from these politicians on democracy issues versus immigration issues? And the difference is that corporations have never pledged to stop giving political contributions before. It's a lot easier for Adidas to drop Kanye from their advertising than it is for them to stop giving money to politicians who sit on committees that affect their business interests. And in one way, their promise to stop contributing after January 6th was really big, but now maybe it was too big for them to have actually, credibly stuck to.
I like that framing. Like maybe they didn't realize what they were getting into. I saw that there was. See the time, and we can always go back to more questions. But I saw that there was a hand in the audience, and so if you guys just want to stop and stand up, and just give us your name and your question in the back in the black shirt. Yeah, that's you. Yep.
Hi. My name is Dieter Zimbauer. I'm from Europe. I'm working in Europe.
Can you use the mic?
Sorry, I didn't realize there was a mic.
Can you hear me better?
Yes, thank you.
So I'm living in Europe. I'm working in Europe. I'm working at a Danish university. And about 2 months ago, I took meaningful action in your money in politics system without knowing it. And I think it's very weird. So I'm going to tell you this story very quickly. So my pension fund, it's a Swedish university pension fund, realized that the SFOF, the State Financial Officer Foundation here, like a group of Republican financial officers that is very much spearheading the anti-ESG, the anti-woke movement, blacklisting asset managers, et cetera, is sponsored, among other, by a asset manager, Hermes Federated, that my pension fund is doing business with. So they were the platinum sponsor for the annual meeting of that Republican Financial Officers Foundation, right? Happened to be on the website, unfortunately, for a while, so they like serendipitously spotted that. There were protests actually outside Hermes offices in the UK, in the streets. Some climate activists went out there, but then the pension funds wrote and wanted some answers from Hermes, and they rallied some other pension funds from Australia that are also very active. And at the end of the day, Hermes pulled out of the sponsorship, right, of that particular group. Now, I think this is a very interesting example because it's super weird, right? So, I did not know about this. I am a European citizen working in Europe, and I'm somehow taking action in your country, in your political system, right? But I think what it shows to me is some kind of early signals of that we are kind of in a system of real change, like with all this kind of business politics interaction. And I think it's good to talk about pressure coming from investors, coming from consumers, but I think and I'm working on climate lobbying, responsible climate lobbying, but I think we need to raise the relevance of political activity by business to the level of materiality for investors, for consumers, and then we are opening up completely new pathways towards accountability, right? Because then I can go and sue for misleading marketing. I can go sue for investor defrauding, et cetera, et cetera. And this is already happening in the climate area. So there are some people challenging companies that engaged politically in ways that was not aligned with their green credentials that they put forward. And because in Europe investors start recognizing this as material, you can actually go and start suing the companies, right? And you get like some early signals that they're positive verdicts. So I just love to hear your opinion on like whether this is some pathways that we could promisingly follow in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your observation. And so I think back to the Earth Summit in 1992 when this idea of materiality, began to come about, right? And sustainability, it had been sustainable development, then it became sustainability. And corporations were asked to do more. They were asked to be accountable, right? And that Earth was one of their clients, right? And they were responsible for certain outcomes, and their behavior and their operational practices had a direct impact on the health of our planet. So that was 30 years ago, right? So here we are today. Hopefully it won't take 30 years, but I think the acceleration that we see of the shining of light on corporate behavior, transparency, the reports that groups like CREW do are really increasing the pressure on companies because companies think about it from a risk perspective, right? Reputational risk, financial risk, legal risk. Robert mentioned something about talent competition. That's a risk. If you work for a company that's being tarnished in the media and you're seen as an irresponsible actor, I have other choices of where I want to go. So, the campaign, there are multiple campaigns that need to be run. One is about within the ESG community itself, which is doing a good job, I think, and increasing pressure. Another is from activist groups and then a third is within the business community itself, who has to think about risks. And the political people within those companies, are now being forced to talk to the legal office, to folks who work in DEI, and it's slow and it's a culture change. It's not a speedy process. These are large, complex organizations with 80,000 people, right? And these people often don't talk to each other anyway. So ideally, the CEO, he or she, feels it's now important to get aligned because the risks are going to increase. So that's one response to that. But thank you for bringing that story to our attention. It's a great example of an interconnected world.
I guess we should say thank you also. Did you in the gray? Yeah.
Yeah, Jim Lardner. I'm here as a reporter for the New Yorker. I just wanted to pose another line of connection between January 6th and corruption, see what thoughts you have about it. And the best way I can illustrate it is by referring to two books, or actually, Sarah Chase has written a couple of books in which she argues, looking at various countries around the world, starting with Afghanistan, that popular disgust with corruption fuels support for authoritarian regimes and for fundamentalist movements. Right. And the other book, Arlie Russell Hochschild's book called Strangers in Their Own Land, about Louisiana, she writes about people in southern Louisiana who we would call environmentalists if you were only inquiring about their attitude toward what the chemical and fossil fuel companies have done to their land and their waterways. But these same people almost unanimously would never think of voting for a candidate for office who supported stronger regulation of those companies, because their level of disgust with corruption is really subsumed by disgust with government and lack of faith in the ability of government ever to do anything good. And I might add, Louisiana's political record gives them plenty of reason to think that way. So how do you break that vexing?
Robert or Ciara, do you want to take that?
Okay. So I think about this all the time and talk about it. First of all, I'm from South Carolina. It's not Louisiana, but it's the same sort of people, the same sort of issues, where I grew up seeing people frustrated at government for all of these things that both state and federal government, realizing that they were voting for exactly the opposite, the people who weren't going to fix the things that they were frustrated about with the government. But the other thing that a lot of us, especially in the campaign finance field, talk about is that Trump, one of the reasons that he was able to sell himself was the whole drain the swamp thing. And the fact of the matter is that Americans, I'd say particularly for the last 20, but probably 40, 50 years, have been seeing Washington turn into a place where it's full of lobbying firms. Corporations are buying up lobbying firms. They're spending tens of millions of dollars. The wealthy are giving contributions and getting access. And regular people are not heard from. There's an Onion article from 10 or 15 years ago that was, the headline was, "American people hire high power lobbyists to promote interests." And like the joke there is that, when the Obamacare was being debated, there were something like 4 lobbyists for every member of Congress that were going and talking to those members. There were articles about pharmaceutical companies and healthcare companies about how they didn't even know how many lobbyists that they had hired. And people see that imbalance, and then they look at their lives where they are dealing with water that can catch on fire, with healthcare. Hospitals are hiring debt collectors that are going around and throwing people in jail and stuff for their healthcare bills. Like, this is stuff that doesn't happen in other countries. And they're saying, why are all these people going and like they're getting rich in Washington and nothing is changing for me? So Trump wasn't, I mean, that allowed for Trump. And in this case, Trump is the authoritarian. I mean, I don't think it's that outrageous to say that he did not want any accountability. He did not want he saw himself as the top of the executive branch, where, in fact, right before he left, he wanted to create that whole Schedule F system where it would allow him to fire anyone, almost anyone in the government that wasn't following his rules. So essentially, civil service would be on the chopping block. And I mean, that's an authoritarian move. And I think it all sort of makes sense in this in the sense that we have this campaign finance system that allows and cultivates a feedback loop between elected officials and wealthy interests, in that the wealthy interests need access and influence with those elected officials, and the elected officials need the money that they get from those powerful interests. And it just goes around and around and around, and everybody else watches it from the outside and sees that nothing is changing for them.
I'll be slightly more optimistic. I mean, when you do this work, you have to have, your head screwed on straight, and it's hard to not get depressed. But you also have to be optimistic to do this work. So I know in his heart, Robert is also a true optimist, or else you wouldn't bother to do this work. Yeah. So my optimistic thing is I am looking at the Gen Z voters and what they said to pollsters. And one of the things they talked about was, number one, they were worried about reproductive freedoms, and number two, they were worried about democracy itself. And I think that might speak to lots of different messengers carrying the idea that democracy was on the ballot in 2022. And I think if you actually tell that to voters, some of them will pick it up. One of the great things about Gen Z is it's a big generation, and so they haven't even all aged up to 18. There are more of them coming, and I am hopeful that care that they showed for our democratic process will be carried into the future.
Just three things to build on your point. One is Congress is suspect and vulnerable to lobbyists because the institution itself is weak. So I said I just met with 7 Senate offices in the past 2 days. In many cases, I'm talking to 28-year-olds. Nothing wrong with 28-year-olds, right? They're smart, but they're not very experienced, right? So no knock generationally, but these are not highly resourced, experienced experts on the issue. So they are dependent on lobbyists to show up and educate them. That's a fact. So we need to think about how we modernize and upgrade the capacity of congressional offices. Number two, this idea about the politician taking advantage and claiming the system's corrupt. As Robert said, Trump was a master of that, but Trump borrowed, from the authoritarian playbook. He either knew or somebody told him, probably somebody told him because he doesn't read, about what Orban and others were doing. So he got that idea and he played it really successfully. And third is, one antidote is to have a more civically educated population. So, if Americans don't understand about the 3 branches of government, we're in deep trouble. So, this infrastructure here, needs to encourage civics education also.
And I'll just add one thing that I think speaks to your question, which is I think in the Trump years, we were often focused on the corruption coming from the executive branch and kind of how that plays into rising authoritarianism. But I think we also have to pay attention to the other 2 branches of government and the fact that they don't have strict ethics codes. For instance, Congress has not passed a stock trading ban. The Supreme Court has no ethics codes. So if we actually do care about democracy and stemming the tide of authoritarianism, I think the other branches have some work to do to prove to the American public that they're worthy. Yes.
Yeah, Joe Santorino from Miami Beach.
It's on.
He has a mic.
Okay,
You want to hold it closer to your.
sure.
Yeah.
I was disconcerted, as some of you were also, about some of the really poor, extreme candidates who have had some success, election deniers and so forth. But we also know that some of that success came with Democratic support from it's known, and we don't know how much, because some of it may have come through dark money. I just wonder if anybody wants to comment on the ethics of that and how that comports with democracy.
When you say Democratic support, are you referring to in the primary stage?
Right. I mean, I would say yes. In the primaries, certainly some of those candidates were getting support from Democratic sources.
Yeah.
We know that, and we don't know how much, but I imagine it may have resulted in some of these people getting those nominations. So, I mean, I'd like to
Yeah,
know
I mean,
what the panel thinks of the ethics of that.
Yeah, I think it's ethical misconduct, for that much money and that much effort to be put into raising the profile of those people. The assumption was those crazies would lose, and the strategy worked, but not always. But it also elevated and gave much more visibility to these theories, right? In part, the independent state legislative theory, which, we could do a whole nother session on, was probably furthered in its and captivated more attention because the Democrats, or political operatives raised the profile of people who supported that idea. So, it had an unintended consequence, I think.
Justine, do you think that the grassroots folks saw that as a mismatch? I mean, you work with the grassroots, you see that. Do you think they realized that they were making a mistake? potentially making a mistake.
I think what's so interesting about this conversation is that, as we were talking about before, is that I think kind of this January 6th moment and its aftermath just showed that a lot of what we presume to be law and institutions are norms rather than something that is in place. And I think that is something that is where civil society comes in and really resonates with people on the ground as well. And I think the other point that I'd add to this as well, and others have raised this, is that, thinking about the authoritarian playbook, is that many things that authoritarians do is undermine and erode ethics and accountability norms at the level of civil society. So as a result, we need to bolster those norms in addition to strengthening laws. And I think that is something that seems to resonate as we start talking about, whether this is something that people saw coming or not, whether people feel cheated. So thinking in a broader movement building sense around what are those other tools and technologies for raising these issues.
I saw a question. Yes. You just have to hold it really close.
Okay, so that's on. You can hear
Even
me?
closer.
Closer than this. I don't have to
Oh, maybe it's not on.
Maybe it turned off somehow.
I don't see like a red light or anything.
Hello?
Hi, my name is Michelle Labonte, and I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. So now I can speak my own mind and not my government talking points. And I've spent a lot of time in countries like Hungary and seen backsliding. So watching it here, while surprising, you sort of see the signs of what could happen. And one of the things in thinking about, particularly the money that we're talking about here, is anybody looking on the demand side, right? As long as there's political parties who are running elections and primaries that demand all this money, people will find a way to get it to them. So it seems to me that looking at how the parties conduct their business is a place to start. That, again, most countries I've ever worked in, you can only spend money and advertise for like 6 weeks before the campaign. If we did that, then you wouldn't need the obscene amounts of money that go into first the primaries, then the regular elections, and it's a never-ending cycle. Therefore, people need to spend all their time fundraising because that's their bread and butter. And it seems to me, while we're talking about the suppliers, we should be perhaps spending more time with the demand side. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is the way that the Supreme Court has decided its campaign finance jurisprudence. Back in Buckley versus Vallejo in the 1970s, Congress had post-Watergate actually put in expenditure limits, and those were challenged in Buckley, and the Supreme Court decided that those were unconstitutional. And hence, as Justice White in his dissent in Buckley said, we've put our candidates on a fundraising treadmill because the contribution limits are limited, but the expenditures are unlimited, which puts everyone in this horrible arms race where they are just fearful that their opponent will outspend them, so they keep on raising money.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point you make, and there are a few remedies. One is a more competitive political system. So ranked choice voting and open primaries opens up the possibilities for more moderate candidates, which helps deal with the extremes on the right and the left. That may also minimize the need for money, maybe. But, there was a seminal piece written by a woman named Catherine Gale, who's a business person, and Michael Porter, professor at Harvard back in 2017, about the duopoly, right? These two major political businesses, right? The Democrats and Republicans, huge, they're billion-dollar enterprises, right? They have designed the system to basically benefit a large cohort of consultants, very well-paid media advisors who are benefiting from the system that they are managing, right? So as you probably know, it's very hard to mount an independent national campaign. Ross Perot did it because he had a lot of his own money. But otherwise, it's really difficult to get on the ballot in states. So part of the political reform movement in this country at the local and state level is pushing these disruptive ideas about creating more choice, more competition, offering opportunities for people who haven't been able to get into the Democratic or Republican parties to now compete. That may be part of the solution to reducing the demand side for the cash.
So it's funny, my sort of trajectory is the opposite of yours, where I lived abroad. I've lived in France and Taiwan and studied around in Asia as well, and came to DC to get my master's in U.S. foreign policy, thinking I was going into the Foreign Service. And I actually read a book called So Damn Much Money. I highly recommend it to all of y'all. There's a number of other great books, but it's about the history of money in politics. And one thing that's fascinating about sort of the question that you're asking is most of the people in the system hate it. The thing is that, one thing that a lot of us don't realize is that members of Congress almost every day have to go to call centers across the street from their buildings where they work and sit shoulder to shoulder with other members of Congress and dial for dollars. They don't want to do that. Even some of the biggest fundraisers, that love going to the actual fundraisers, they don't like it as doing it as much as they have to do it. But the thing is that because the Supreme Court has decided that this is all First Amendment issue, there's never going to be any regulation of it. So both sides are just constantly going to keep ramping this up because they feel like they have to have this money in order to win elections. So it's hard to see how we're ever going to get to that point. But we do have opportunities to limit it. We do have within that framework, we don't have to have a Citizens United. We don't have to have McCutcheon. The funny thing, people forget about McCutcheon, but this was a decision in 2014. There used to be, even after Buckley v. Vallejo and all the other cases that came after, there was still a cap on the overall amount of hard money that you could give. Hard money is like directly to a campaign and to a party or to a regular PAC. And they took that limit off. And suddenly all the lobbyists who had been saying, no, I already maxed out, I already hit my cap, so sorry, when they get the calls, they couldn't say that anymore. So they had to start just giving even more. And the members of Congress had to keep calling them. So they're all sort of trapped in this system. I mean, they could do more, but it's really interesting to me that they all hate it, but that's sort of, I guess, what they signed up for at this point.
Well, I feel like we could talk about this for a very long time. And I want to thank the panelists for being here today and thank all of you for joining us, especially during dinner hour. Yeah, just thanks everyone for being here. And if you have any questions, we're happy to chat offline. Thanks.